Jeff?
Great. Thanks, Camille, and welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in and for your interest in the Healthy Watersheds Consortium program. I wanted to give you a picture of your presenters for the day. Now, I know you've probably seen us before, and I know what you're thinking. I recognize those guys, and they're great at saving planets, but what the heck do they know about saving watersheds? Well, actually, here is a real picture of us. Maybe not as handsome or quite as first, I can assure you, equally ambitious when it comes to saving watersheds. And I also have to apologize to you because today Peter Stengel with the U.S. Endowment is not available to join us to present. So that means that I'm flying mostly solo with some help from Camille. Okay, so enough corny jokes aside, let's get to the program. What I'm going to do over the next 30 to 40 minutes is walk you through some different aspects of the Healthy Watersheds program. I also want to say that we are interested in hearing from you about some of your ideas, and you are welcome to contact Peter or I. Our emails are right there. And we actually encourage you to contact us before you apply. We're more than happy to talk to you about your ideas and give you candid feedback on whether we think your ideas for proposals are competitive. And we'll have this up a couple different times during the webinar, but the website there, the U.S. Endowment's website, with their RFP section of their website is where the Healthy Watersheds information will be. There's the website again. You can find information on the U.S. Endowment's website. You can also sign up for our periodic Healthy Watersheds Consortium newsletter. It's short. It won't clog up your inbox, but it will provide you with periodic updates, including upcoming webinars, especially on some of the completed projects that we're now starting to get results from, which you may find useful, give you a better sense of the kinds of things we funded, and they've also got some pretty innovative approaches that they've been working on. And there's actually on the website there also some previously recorded webinars from some of the work that's been done already. We've had, I think, 3 different webinars now from different projects. So let's talk about the program a little bit. This program really originated with leadership from the EPA and their Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds. And the NRCS is also now a partner with us, and we're thrilled to have them on board. And what we're really trying to do with this particular program is to try to protect watersheds that are in good condition before they become degraded. We spend a lot of money in this country on trying to fix damaged watersheds, and it's cheaper and possibly more effective to prevent some of that damage from occurring in the first place. We also see this program as a magnet to draw examples together and share what we're learning about watershed protection so that others may duplicate and expand on that. So try to think of this program as really a prevention program and not as a restoration program. There are other sources of funding for restoration, and if you're interested primarily in restoration, this may not be a good fit for your work. So to give you a better sense of what we're after here, if we want good water quality in our watersheds with functioning freshwater ecosystems, what happens on the land itself is really important. If more of your watershed is in some form of natural habitat or natural vegetation cover, it will tend to be healthier than if it's mostly altered. And so the focus of the program is really more on the land than on the actual water itself. And if watershed protection equals land protection for this program, we've identified 2 primary different types of land protection, or what protection means. For our program, the first type of protection is direct land protection using either acquisition of land or conservation easements to prevent conversion to non-compatible uses, to essentially keep non-point source pollution from happening in the first place. And the second type of protection that we're willing to consider for our program is what we call stewardship. In some areas, land may be already protected but needs to be maintained to keep the watershed healthy. So for example, in many parts of the western U.S., we have problems with catastrophic wildfire, which can affect water supplies. And I've included a picture which shows a forest before and after treatment for fuels reduction. So the land cover's the same, it's still a forest, but the treated forest is healthier for the watershed. It's also worth mentioning that our program is open to all land uses, not just forests. So if you're working on a project that involves working lands, whether that's working forests or grazing lands, all of those are fine in terms of the types of projects that we're willing to consider. So just because the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities is the manager of the program, it's not just a forest conservation program. In terms of the eligibility for the program, we try to keep the program fairly open to different types of applicants. Just a note about federal agencies, you can partner with federal agencies. You can even get support letters from them, and we often do for our applications, but we can't fund federal agencies directly. But otherwise, for the most part, we're willing to consider most other potential applicants. We do have some funding restrictions. We can't fund advocacy efforts through the program or litigation. We've also decided not to fund land acquisition directly. Why not? Well, we sort of did our own assessment and realized that our dollars would only go so far if we did allow them to be used for direct land acquisition. We might be able to save 20 or 30,000 acres, which would be a help. But what we'd rather do with our dollars is actually help you to create new sources of land protection funding or tap existing dollars in ways that you haven't been able to in the past, or possibly increase your capacity to do more protection so that over time more acres are protected. And we'll get into this with some of the different examples that we've funded as well. In terms of available funding this year, we expect to have just over $1 million available for grants. We do require a match. We prefer that match be non-federal. Funds for the program come from a combination of dollars from the EPA and the NRCS and the U.S. Endowment. And so some of our dollars are private and some of our dollars are public. And so it would be, because of the challenge of matching federal dollars with federal dollars, it's easier if we have non-federal dollars as part of your match. The other thing to point out about this slide is that unlike in previous years, if you've heard about the program or tuned in the past, is that because of the nature of our funding now, projects have to be completed within essentially 2.5 years. So if you were to receive a grant in 2019, you would still have to make sure that all of the work associated with the grant is completed by essentially the fall of 2021. And that's different from previous years when we had 3 or even 4 years available for grants. So just want you to be aware of that as you're thinking about developing your budget and your proposals. And the other thing to mention is that the size of the awards, between $50,000 and $300,000, there are slightly different amounts associated with our different grant categories, which I'll get into. But just to clarify, this is total award amount. So if you're applying for a 2-year grant, you can apply for a couple $100,000, but you can't apply for a couple $100,000 each year. So we have had that in the past where people misinterpreted the RFP a little bit and said, oh, okay, I'll apply for a 3-year grant at $200,000, so it's a $600,000 grant, and we only have smaller amounts to award for the total size of the grant. In terms of the schedule, there's still plenty of time to contact us and ask questions and put your application materials together. The deadline is not until February 4th, 2019 at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's a pretty hard deadline. We encourage you to contact us again. As part of the process, we're also creating a forum to share ideas in the earlier part of this year, we brought together our grantees from our 2016 and 2017 round of grant making, and we had a great retreat. People learned a lot about each other's work from around the country and found it very valuable, and so we'd like to do that again in 2019. And so for those of you thinking about applying, we would ask you to fairly soon after receiving word about your grant, we'd ask you to be participating in a grantee meeting, which might be someplace else in the country. The good news is that we'd be able to provide you funding for that travel. However, it just would be worth thinking about making sure that someone from your team might be available to attend that grantee meeting. So let me shift a little bit to talking more about what we're looking for in terms of the program. You could think of our dollars really as more of a fuel additive to help boost performance in terms of watershed protection. And what might that boost really look like? Well, maybe the best use of these dollars is to hire a person who can work on some particular aspect of watershed protection. Maybe there's a source of funding that you know about but has been difficult to access, and maybe you need some experts that might be able to help you access those funds. Or maybe your local water utility would actually support watershed protection if they had a business case for doing so. And so maybe working with them to develop that business case might be something that you could use our dollars for, and that might free up money that could be used for more watershed protection activity. So basically, what activities can we support that might actually help you to achieve much more longer term and much more significant watershed protection activity into the future? A little bit more to clarify what we're looking for. The boost that you may need may be very specific to your watershed. Many of you are experts on what's going on within your particular watershed. You know the players, you know what the challenges are, and you probably have a good idea of what some of the best solutions might be. So we're interested in hearing about what those are. What you're doing might be innovative. It might be something that no one's ever tried before, and that's great. And we're willing to provide some resources for that and take some risks. But it's not necessary. If you're doing something that's been done in other parts of the country or something that you've done in some other part of the watershed and you're just looking to replicate it and it could result in thousands and thousands of additional acres of land protected, that's okay too. We are a little bit more interested in seeing the larger context in your thinking and planning as part of your application. So for example, what's your 25 or 50-year vision for watershed protection? What are the resources that you need in order to achieve that vision? And what's your plan for getting to them? You may not know that. You may need help with developing such a plan, or you may know those have that information handy and can put that into your application, and then we have a picture of where you're planning on going, both in the short term and the long term. And another clarifying point, I guess, sometimes it's easier to understand the grant program by talking about what it doesn't fund. And so here are some examples of some things that we would probably consider to be not competitive for our program. Even though these are important activities, we don't fund through our program end-of-pipe solutions or specifically restoration. So if you need to replace a culvert in one of your stream channels, that's not something we'll fund. Stream restoration projects also not something we can fund. Again, end-of-pipe solutions are not part of what this program is about. I would also say that even education is something that we would probably be unlikely to support unless we could see how that work directly leads to more protection within the watershed as measured by acres conserved. And a final point would also be that urban projects are also unlikely to be competitive, often simply because they are often in heavily converted areas that need restoration. However, I should note that we have funded activities in some metropolitan areas, and I've got a couple of examples later in the webinar. So if you're unsure at the end of the webinar and you think you've got an idea for some work in a metro area, please contact us to discuss. We'll be happy to do that. Over the last 3 years of grant making, thanks in part to some of the proposals we've received, we've come across a selection of different programs that may be complementary with our program. They're not necessarily designed around watershed protection, but they can contribute to different aspects of it, and they may be able to provide you with funding to support some aspects of your work. We encourage collaboration with other programs that might also achieve watershed protection, and we welcome evidence of such collaboration within our proposals. So for example, several of our existing grantees have received RCPP or Regional Conservation Partnership Program grants through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS, and they're using those dollars to help conserve watershed lands through conservation easement. And that's terrific. And our program is complementary in that we're providing some of the capacity, some of the people power, if you will, to help be able to execute some of those projects. And so there is some complementarity there with some of these different programs. And you know, we encourage you to bring us other ideas as well, and we can explore those with you. In terms of the different categories of funding that we have 3 different possible categories of funding, and we ask you to slot your proposal into one of these 3. There are descriptions of these in the request for proposals itself. When I think about these, I think of them as with a single word: impact, readiness, or transferability. So for our watershed action projects, can we help you have an outsized impact by completing a large project that you are in the midst of doing and you need a little boost to get over the finish line? Or for some of our building watershed protection capacity projects, where are you on the spectrum of having needed capacity for watershed protection? Are you just getting started, or are you ready for a grant to go to a different level? Let's say you've been protecting a couple thousand acres a year in your watershed, and you think that you can double or triple that pace, and you've got some ideas on how you can do that if you had some additional capacity. Or can your project create a new way of advancing watershed protection that others can use? So for advancing the state of practice, we're really curious about whether or not what you're doing is really unique to your watershed situation, or is it something that someone else could pick up and use in some other part of the country. And the last point about these categories is that while we ask you to put your proposal into one of these 3, we may move your project to a different category if it seems like a better fit. So there's no penalty if you don't get it right. We're not going to ignore your proposal simply because we felt like it was submitted in the wrong category. And so don't sweat this too much, but read the descriptions, do your best, and suggest which category you would like to apply in. On the application form itself, one point about this is that the actual application is a fill-in PDF, and it has not been posted yet on the Endowment's website. It will be posted in early November. We'll still give you about 3 months to be able to get familiar with the application form and so forth. And I apologize for not getting that to you in advance. The U.S. Endowment is in the process of revamping some pieces of its website, and so we're waiting until that work is done before we post the website, just to avoid problems with people downloading it. It is a fill-in PDF form, and there will be character limits associated with each of the fields for the answers to the questions on the application. These character limits are to help encourage you to be concise as you're putting together your application. It's often harder to write a short amount than a longer amount of text, so give yourself time to do this. The website also contains guidance on constructing your goals, hurdles, etc. And another point to make about the application is that there will be some questions about various success factors related to watershed protection, and some of this actually is derived from work that was done by the World Resources Institute. They've done some research into what makes watershed protection activities successful. They've got a great report out. There's some information about how to access that within the RFP, and we'll be asking you some questions about some of the success factors that they've identified so that we can get a better understanding of what's going on within your watershed. We're also interested in having you review other watershed protection efforts in other parts of the country to see if there might be others that are similar to yours, or if you can improve on what someone else has done. The main point about this slide on proposal evaluation is just to illustrate that we do look at all components of your proposal. We also have regional reviewers which take a look at these proposals and share their assessments with our national review team. And another point is that there's no extra weight given to any of the 3 different grant categories. So if you apply in the Advancing the State of Practice category, you're not necessarily going to get more points for, in terms of how we evaluate your application. All applications are treated the same. And the main metrics for the Healthy Watersheds program overall are acres of watershed lands conserved and new sources of funding created. But for your individual project, we're going to ask you to propose some performance metrics against which you would judge the success of your own project. So those will be included in your project plan, and you'll be able to report out on those as part of interim reports, which will be due at least 2 different times during the course of the year if you do receive a grant. You may know exactly what to do and how to do it, or you might need some help once you receive a grant. This slide is just to illustrate that there are a number of folks involved with the program, not just myself and Peter, but we've got a couple of other consultants that are involved, and we're all available to help you with your project. Once you receive a grant, we're all very invested in making sure that you're successful, so please feel free to contact us and we can help you with different aspects of your project. Quick summary on the applications that we received in past years, which is not necessarily a reflection of what we're going to be receiving this year, but we have received over 300 applications, and I guess the main point about this slide is that there's been a lot of interest in the program, which is terrific. But there's also therefore been a lot of competition for limited resources. And so just want you to be aware of that. We were overwhelmed in the first year. We've been really thrilled with the applications that we received in the subsequent years, and so we're really looking forward to some great proposals this year as well. And in terms of what we have funded so far, we've made 47 different grants over the last 3 years. We've awarded $8.4 million. And what that tells us is that right now we're awarding and funding about 10% of applicants who come in, so just a reinforcement on the competitiveness of the program, but also to illustrate that there are some potentially impressive results. So much more than 25,000 acres, we actually are hoping to see upwards of 400,000 acres protected over the next few years, given some of the investments we've made, and well over 700 miles of stream protected as well. And certainly, some of the investments we're making are in long-term visions for watershed protection, which could lead to even more protection, millions of acres ultimately, and thousands and thousands of acres of stream miles, which we hope will be the case. So with that, let me wrap up the webinar with some examples of projects that we felt really hit the mark. Like I said, there's 47 awards that we've made, so I can't go through all of them, but I'll touch on a handful of projects to help illustrate some of the different grant categories and some of the different things that we are funding, might give you a better sense of what we're looking for and what we've funded. So the first of these I'd like to share is from Florida in the Charlotte Harbor area, in the western part of the state. This was an opportunity to help an organization finish the protection of a conservation corridor. They needed capacity with lining up funding and putting the pieces together to essentially complete this corridor by protecting an additional 7,000 acres of land in a relatively short period of time. And here's a little bit of how they did it. This next slide shows a little bit about what they did with their funding. We provided them with a $156,000 grant over 3 years, which gave them the ability to have people on staff who could actually put together these land deals and also to assemble the different funding resources, which they were able to do by working with some foundations, local foundations, and also with their water management district. They were able to get a significant amount of money. Together, those dollars came together, and they were able to put together the resources to secure a 1,000-plus acre easement. And it's also worth noting that they are now working on protecting a roughly 6,000 acre tract, which will need about $20 million of funding to completely protect. And they're actually fairly far along in that process as well, and almost there. And so we're very hopeful and hopefully and confident that the group's going to get there and get to the protection of those 7,000 acres. Here's another example from California. This one really knocked our socks off. This was a 47,000 acre forest protection project for a total cost of about $60 million. This was the largest project that the Western Rivers Conservancy has ever done. We really liked this project because it was using a variety of funding mechanisms, new market tax credits, which are fairly complicated and actually needed expert attorneys and other advice to actually be able to set up, but could actually help to provide funding for about 20% of the cost of the project. Loans from the state of California's Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. Carbon credits were another source of revenue as well. And the other thing that was really appealing about this was that they were working very collaboratively with the Yurok tribe, which is the largest tribe in California, to protect land that the tribe would ultimately manage, including a community forest, which can be used once they begin managing it to generate some additional revenue that can be used for management of or stewardship of the land, and a salmon sanctuary as well. So really fantastic project. If we could fund projects like this at this scale every year, we'd be thrilled. So really great work from Western Rivers. Another really ambitious project, this one from the Pacific Forest Trust, a grant made to them, also in California. This was a really bold attempt to change the way we view watershed protection by getting California to create a policy to treat watersheds as part of water infrastructure. So this is really potentially transformational because it could affect so many acres and possibly generate so much funding. The first hurdle, state policy, was actually passed at the end of 2016, which cleared one of their hurdles that they had identified within their project plan. And now Pacific Forest Trust is now working on different finance mechanisms. So the other thing about this one that we really like, and this is one of our advancing the state of practice examples, is that it is potentially transferable. Any state potentially could pick up the policy and the concept that California has done and replicate it as well. And so, we really love that, and anybody that would be interested in kind of pursuing that, we'd love for you to, come to us, and, we'll put you in touch with Pacific Forest Trust, and they can explain how they did it. Here's another example in the category of building watershed protection capacity. This is a grant we made to the Down East Salmon Federation, which is a small but fairly effective organization focused on fish conservation. Part of their operation involves protecting land. So they do a lot of things. They restore streams and they do monitoring and research projects, but they also help protect land. And so they wanted to expand that component of their operations. And so our task was, how can we help them go faster so they can protect hundreds of miles of streams? And we gave them some money so they would have the capacity to actually expand their land trust activities. And now they're making good progress toward their 35-mile protection goal for our grant, and that's putting them on the path toward the probably a couple hundred miles that ultimately need to be conserved within their watershed. So this is also a great example of protecting freshwater ecosystems at larger landscape scale. Here's another example from the Seattle metro area. This was a real test for us of regional governance to determine if that could be used as a tool for watershed protection. So the idea behind this grant was to provide the Puget Sound Regional Council with some funding to incorporate protection goals for watersheds into a regional growth plan and open space plan that they were developing. The challenge is how do you do that and coordinate across 86 jurisdictions? And so, but they've done it, and they've got a really good strategy, I think, now for protecting additional land within their watershed. Now, this is in an urbanizing area, but where we believe the focus of the protection work will probably be mostly in the largely intact and forested portions of the watershed, which contain functional freshwater ecosystems. And I also want to mention that, encouraged by the progress that they've made, earlier this year, we made a grant through our 2018 round to the area as well to support a group called the Emerald Alliance, which will be working closely with the PSRC, and they'll be working to develop finance mechanisms to actually implement some of that protection. Just a couple more examples here, and then we'll be done. Here's an example from the Cleveland metro area. This is actually a blended approach of direct land acquisition and policy. And so working the way that the Chagrin River Watershed Partners work, they've actually got some good relationships with a handful of land trusts working in their area. The land trust will be actually developing a revolving fund for land protection, and it'll be protecting several thousand acres of wetlands and other important habitat areas within the watershed. But the watershed partners are also going to be working with local communities in their area on local land use policy to conserve wetlands and other land along streams using tools like setback buffers. And so this is this blended approach of direct land acquisition and policy that we thought was really intriguing. And it's also another example of an urbanizing area, but we're not actually focused in on the urban core itself. And the last example I'll share with you is with a grant we made to the Foothills Conservancy, which is working in a watershed that serves the Charlotte, North Carolina metro area. And what really drew us to this project was the engagement with several water utilities, 18 water utilities that they've been working with, which all use the watershed, and how they're poised to put together a watershed protection fund, which could be supported by the utilities to help advance watershed protection. So what was really nice about this project is that these collaborations among water utilities are still fairly rare. And we think that this, not only if they can do this, this could also be something that could stimulate some replication around the country as well. So it's helping them build their capacity locally, and it's also helping to potentially provide a model that could be used elsewhere. And the last point I guess I'll make about these examples, that these are mostly positive, and we're thrilled with the progress that our grantees are making. But I should also mention that not everything works the way that it should. And we've already had one rather large forest protection project that's fallen through. It would have employed some really creative finance options, and the concept was really sound. Unfortunately, the timing was not. And we understand that, and we understand that, and even so are willing to take some risks with some of these grants, and that's a nice feature of this program. If you've got a really ambitious project, even though it might be a little bit risky, we're still willing to entertain that possibility. So please don't let that hold you back. So with that, once again, we're happy to talk with you about your project and provide some feedback. To save us all time, we'll give you some candid feedback on whether we think it's competitive. You may decide at the end of the conversation it's not worth your time to apply, but either way, it could save time. So we certainly encourage you to reach out to us, and with that, I guess we can probably transition into any questions that may have come up on the chat. I apologize, I haven't been monitoring that as I've been going through the presentation. But before, because I know some folks may want to drop off at this point, if you don't have any questions, I just want to say thanks to everybody for attending the webinar, for your interest in the program, Special thanks to our funding partners, EPA and NRCS. It's a real delight to work with them. And we're really thrilled about this program, and we look forward to seeing your proposals, talking with you more about your projects, and thanks again for everything you're doing for watershed protection in your area. Thanks. So, Camille, let's go to the chat box. Do we have any questions that folks have?
Yes, we do have a few lined up. So this question comes from Claire. She asks if there are some gray areas between restoration and stewardship, and her example is invasive species removal.
Yeah, good question. I would say that we probably would not actually fund any kind of direct activity on the ground, like an actual weed pull or invasive species removal. But if that activity could be part of a larger plan for stewardship, and you had ideas for how you could generate some funding that would be more sustainable for those types of activities, that might be of interest. I think the concern that we would have with invasives is, as you know, you often have to keep at it. And so what would be the long-term sustainable funding option to generate dollars that would be needed to keep at those invasives within your area? That's probably the best answer I can give right now.
Okay. And we have a question from Patrick, and he asks, what is different with this year's guidelines or focus as compared to previous years?
That's also a good question. There's not a whole lot of difference. The grant categories are essentially the same. The time frame associated with the grants is a little different because you don't have as much time. But otherwise, a lot of what we've been funding is the same. I would say that the addition of stewardship as a possible activity is something we added in the last couple of years. So there's not a whole lot really different from the application and the RFP from last year. So if you're familiar with that. But I would take a look at the RFP and make sure that you're addressing all of the points there. And the application form may be a little different in terms of the formatting as well.
Okay. And we have another question similar to that. Amanda asks, does the amount provided alternate during the years?
I'm not sure I follow completely. I think what you're asking is, does the amount of funding that you can allocate in each of the different years of your grant vary? And if that's the question, that really depends on how you construct your budget. So there will be a form within the application where you would have to outline how you would spend the money within the grant. So let's say you asked for a $100,000 or $150,000 grant, and you wanted it to be over equally divided over 2.5 years. You'd have to kind of do that calculation. Or you could decide that most of the funding would need to actually be spent in the first year, and in the second year you'd want to spend less money. So you could say, well, our budget is structured so that we want to spend $100,000 in the first year and $50,000 in the second year. So it really is up to you in terms of how you construct your budget. You just have to work within the time constraints associated with the grant, so no more than basically 2.5 years.
Okay.
And I hope that answered the question.
Let's see. Jacob asks, how was the $156,000 spent in Florida? And if you could provide a little bit of guidance on what funding was spent on those example projects.
So as I recall with that particular project, the main need for that funding was to provide essentially staff support to be able to negotiate the land deals, work with the stormwater management district, work with the different foundations. So I think it was a combination of providing staff time for not only their director of land protection, but I think also some of the funds may have gone to some of their development team And so one of the features of our program is that you can use funding for people. We just have to understand what role that's going to be, and we would like those funds to be spent on people that are actually directly working on these different protection projects in some fashion.
Okay. Our next question is from Heidi, and she asked, is there a minimum to watershed size?
Okay, so that's a good question. So what we, I think, have said in the past in the application is that we would like to see evidence that you've done some planning at about the HUC 8 scale, so that's a hydrologic unit code. And so sometimes we've gotten proposals from people that are working just within a HUC 12 watershed, and that's pretty small from our perspective. So we'd like to see evidence that you've thought about your watershed at a larger scale. However, the actual work itself may still be focused in on a particular part of your watershed. So you might say, we've looked at our whole watershed, and there's this couple places within a few HUC 12 parts of our watershed where we're going to focus on protection, and that's okay, but we want to see some of the evidence that you've at least looked at that larger watershed area. So if your plans, if you really are talking about just looking at a particular HUC 12 watershed, and that's the planning level that you've worked at, we may ask you to kind of show us evidence that you've thought about the larger area as well.
Okay, our next question is from Alex, and they ask, can you clarify restrictions on using grant funds for advocacy activities?
Grant funds for advocacy are not allowed. So I guess maybe if you need more clarification on that, maybe it would be better for you to give one of us a call, and we can try to help clarify if we understand a little bit more about what specific aspect of advocacy you're thinking about. But generally speaking, no, if you're doing any kind of lobbying, we can't support those activities.
Okay. We have another question. If the funding is to be used to establish a new watershed fund, can a portion of it actually go into the fund itself?
I would say, given the magnitude of the size of funds that would be needed, I would say the answer is probably no. We would probably prefer to figure out how we could use our funds to help you design that fund, or to go out and raise funds for the fund, rather than actually take our money and put it into a water fund, because the idea behind a water fund is you're trying to figure out how to get funds that will be available every year to be able to do either restoration or protection work, hopefully protection work, within the watershed. And so we would prefer that our dollars be used for those supportive activities and not just be put into any kind of essentially a land protection fund. Again, because our dollars are not allowed to be used directly for land protection.
Okay. I believe this is our last question. This one is from Stephanie, and I think it's referring to the Florida project again. Do you have any examples of how the money can be spent other than for staffing?
Sure, yeah. So let's see. So if you needed to, you could use the funding to hire consultants or others to help you with different aspects of watershed protection. So for example, if you needed an economic analysis done to help build a case for watershed protection, you could use the funds for that kind of activity. You could, let's see, there's people that have used the funds in, I guess, a variety of different ways. You could use it to build tools. We've had a couple of different tool building grants where we provided resources that were used to actually create new software that could be used to help analyze watersheds and make decisions about that, where your priorities were. So there's a couple different examples of ways that the funds could be used that are not just about providing resources for, let's say, your land protection staff.
Okay. And this is a follow-up from Stephanie. She asked, could a portion of it be used for lawyer fees associated with drafting new plans?
I think, yes, we have provided funds for the development of plans and assessments. I don't know exactly what role the lawyers would have to play associated with the plan, but generally speaking, we could support any experts who would need to be involved in the development of a plan or assessment for watersheds. But I think a point about plans, because we have gotten several proposals associated with plans, and this is just for folks to think about, we certainly can provide support to help you develop a plan if you don't have one. However, we would probably also want to see some evidence of how you're planning on using that plan, and we'd love to see some kind of a clear path toward how that plan is going to get you to additional protection. So what's your ideas for how you use that plan to then, go and protect more land? Are you developing that plan, for example, with your local water utilities, and then the water utilities are going to think about putting money into a water fund or something like that to help implement it? Are you going to take that plan and work with a local government for implementation? So we'd love to see what's the next step beyond just having a plan. Having a plan is even considered one of the success factors that is connected to some of the research that WRI has done, but it's not the only success factor. So we're a little hesitant about just supporting a plan. We want to see some evidence of what you're going to do with that plan.
Okay. Well, I believe that is all the questions we have, unless anyone has some last-minute questions they'd like to put into the chat.
Super. Well, thank you again, everybody, for attending, and for those of you who hung in there the whole time, really appreciate it. Again, if you've got additional questions specifically about your watershed area and your specific circumstances, please feel free to reach out to myself or Peter. We'll try to be as responsive as we can be and available over the next 3 months before applications are due. Please don't wait until the very last minute to contact us, and it's probably in your best interest as well. But we're more than happy to set up times to talk with you on the phone or try to answer questions by email. So thanks again. All right, I think that's it. Thanks, Camille.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.